Good morning and welcome. My name is Renate Tenbusch. I'm the director of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung EU office in Brussels. I welcome the audience and also welcome my interview partners. Ambassador Nobuyasu Abe, a warm welcome to you. It's good to see you again. Dr. Ulrich Kuehn, a warm welcome to you too. Good to see you. Ambassador Abe, Dr. Kuehn, from your perspectives, what is the current state of the nuclear disarmament architecture, particularly in the context of the actual dynamics between Russia and the United States? Is the disarmament architecture in a deep crisis?
Yes, I think arms control, nuclear disarmament architecture in the world is in deep trouble. The US-Russian arms control agreements, treaties have been abandoned one after another, and there's only one remaining. So the architecture of nuclear disarmament is crumbling. I think we need to quickly restore the world's arms control nuclear disarmament structure.
Yeah, let me just echo what the ambassador said and perhaps take it a bit further because as introduced us, I'm from academia, and in academia you find also in the think tank world people that are not only speaking of the crisis of nuclear arms control, but that are saying this is the actual end of nuclear arms control. So the ambassador already mentioned there is only one last man or treaty standing. That's the New START Treaty between the Russian Federation and the United States of America. The last 4 years, the 4 years of Donald Trump, the 4 years of Russia, again modernizing its strategic nuclear weapons, were devastating for nuclear arms control. We have seen additional treaties crumble: the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. The United States has pulled out of an important verification instrument, the Open Skies Treaty. In general, and this is what I'm very worried about when we talk about global affairs in 2020, restraint is out of fashion. The big powers show their muscles, and this is a development that we all have to address, at best multilaterally, but the chances are not good at the moment.
I would like to go back to Dr. Kuehn and ask you, under these circumstances, to your opinion, what are the perspectives of the NPT for the upcoming year? Can the NPT adapt, or is there a need for an alternative?
Well, first of all, let's focus a little bit on the fact that the NPT Review Conference that happens every 5 years in New York City had to be postponed due to the Corona crisis. And that very fact in itself is, I would say, positive as well as negative. It's positive because the NPT Review Conference will now happen next year with a new US administration that views arms control at least more positive than the current one. Perhaps it will even take place under the condition that Russia and the United States have already agreed to extend the New START Treaty. That in itself will provide a more positive background than the NPT Review Conference that we would have had in 2020, would have Corona not happened. Perhaps the negative thing here is that because of the postponement, another treaty now legally entered into force, and you mentioned it, the ban treaty. Mm-hmm. Now the ban treaty puts quite some pressure on certain NPT members, and I would add our two countries, Japan as well as Germany, into the group of those countries where the pressure now lie on. There are those countries that have signed the ban treaty, and now 50 countries have ratified officially the treaty, and with that it will enter into force in January 2020, that are simply saying we need to ban nuclear weapons. We need to get rid of those weapons. Then we have the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. Some of those, unfortunately, are not part of the NPT. And then there is the large group of countries that basically are either allies of the United States, for instance, like Germany is through the NATO organization, which is a nuclear organization and which officially states that it is a nuclear organization, or which have bilateral military and political arrangements with the United States, like those countries in East Asia, like Japan, South Korea, or Australia, for instance. And then there are some countries that have also military agreements with the Russian Federation, but there are not that many. And it is on those countries where now the pressure rests, because some of those countries, like Germany, like Japan, have also an interest in pursuing nuclear disarmament. So now the ban treaty supporters say, what is it? What do you guys want? Do you guys want to have disarmament, then follow the ban treaty, sign it? Or do you insist on relying for your security on nuclear arms? But then you are not helping to fulfill the pledge of the NPT in Article 6, which clearly says we want to work towards a world without nuclear weapons.
Yes.
So a difficult situation.
You say under these circumstances, are the TPNW and the NPT complementary, or is the TPNW endangering the success of the NPT, as the opponents most of the time argue?
In an ideal world, it would be complementary. And what do I mean by an ideal world? I mean a world where the different factions and countries and coalitions continue talking to each other and try to pursue some of their objectives together. But once more, the deep crisis of nuclear arms control during the last 5, 10, perhaps even 20 years, if we go back to the end of, for instance, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2001, have shown that the goal of complete nuclear abolition is moving much further to the future. And we have talked already about China, and we have talked about the new competitions that are now showing up in the 21st century. It does not look like we're moving towards the goal of nuclear abolition, but it looks like some states took the wrong turn and we're moving towards the other direction. And this is why we have the ban treaty. The ban treaty is a sign of deep frustration of a majority of states, and the other states need to start taking this frustration serious and need to start addressing it. And perhaps we can talk about the little steps later that some states like Germany or Japan can take to build some bridges between those two factions, basically on the one side, the nuclear weapon states, on the other one, those ones that are now supporting the ban treaty.
My question already relates to what you just said. How could Germany position itself in a constructive way towards the entry into force of the TPNW?
The first thing is basically helping not to solve the security crisis that we have in the European region. And here we talk about the situation between NATO and Russia, but helping to decrease tensions. And here Germany is very active, but I think that Germany needs to be more active within NATO and find states that would support also non-nuclear policies and decrease the current reliance that we see, particularly in rhetorical terms on NATO's side on nuclear weapons. As I said, the alliance officially states it's a nuclear alliance, and it continues to be a nuclear alliance as long as nuclear weapons exist. Okay, that basically says, well, we cannot do anything because, you know, the ball is in your court. I think here NATO needs to be more active and needs to come up and hopefully also under the Biden administration with some forward-looking initiatives, particularly as regards Russia, and to test Russian seriousness when it comes to confidence and security building measures in Europe. Perhaps it turns out that Russia is not interested, but well, at least I think we should try to test Moscow here. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is, how do we deal with this new beast? the ban treaty. And I think that in German we say, es bricht einem nichts aus der Krone, which means the crown does not lose one of its edges. If Germany would, for instance, attend the first state conference of the ban treaty as an observing country, which means Germany would not officially sign it, it would not promise to sign it, it doesn't even have to make any statements in that regard. It would simply say, look, we want to be here, we want to see what's going on, and report back to Berlin, and we don't even have to share our assessment, but just be there. Just recognize that there is a majority of states that think that this instrument is important, and it looks as though it will become more important in the future. So if Germany does the opposite and says or acts like the treaty is not there, that's not good.
You mentioned already the conference on disarmament in Geneva. This conference was instrumental in drafting numerous arms control agreements, most importantly, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. No, that's, yes, and the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. But they failed when it came to the ban treaty. How could the conference on disarmament in Geneva be strengthened again? Is there even a possibility in order to facilitate a more constructive role also with the ban treaty?
Well, Geneva Conference is a very important body, but one big problem is it has a very strict consensus rule. Every member of the conference has to agree to move forward or to adopt any treaty or agreement. And that has been the problem. Well, the CTBT was almost the last treaty they have adopted. In fact, it could not adopt it. It had to be brought into the General Assembly to be adopted because of the strict consensus rule. If any one member objects, it cannot be done. So one way to improve the situation is to change the rule of procedure, not to require strict consensus. You may create a new rule saying that you can decide with majority or with some special codified majority. That is one way. The other way is to go out of the conference in Geneva to work on and adopt a treaty somewhere else. And exactly the nuclear ban treaty was done that way. It was done in the General Assembly. So it's being done. So if it doesn't work, there are many other ways to do so, to do the work.
The two biggest threats for non-proliferation efforts are North Korea, we mentioned that already, and since the cancellation of the JCPOA, again, also Iran. In both cases, sanctions are playing a crucial role. How do you evaluate the experiences in this case so far? Are sanctions really an effective means against proliferation, Ambassador?
Well, in my view, sanctions alone can hardly produce the intended results. It's very hard to do. It has to be combined with the diplomatic negotiations and also political economic incentives to make the target country to comply. So I think negotiations and incentives have to go together with sanctions. There's only one case in history I remember sanctions worked. That was a case of South Africa. It took many years, but eventually South Africa abandoned apartheid and abandoned the nuclear weapons. That was I think, only one successful case I remember. In this case, it is important that the countries who have close relations with the target country have to genuinely work hard to implement sanctions. Then it can succeed. Otherwise, there will be sanction evasions. Countries do not impose sanctions seriously, then it doesn't work. And what you're seeing in North Korea is a latter case.
Also to you the questions, Ambassador. What are the perspectives of the NPT for the upcoming year, to your opinion? Is the TPNW the alternative that will bring new dynamics, despite the fact that the nuclear states and the NATO member states, as well as the US allies, haven't signed it and are determined not to do it?
Well, I think the NPT, if it is left as it is, will slowly and gradually lose its relevance. Countries pay less and less attention, and the members have less and less incentive to observe the obligations of the treaty. But perhaps no country will dare to kill the treaty because they don't want to get the blame of putting a treaty to end. But I think we have to do something to keep the treaty as a viable tool to stop nuclear proliferation. TPNW, the ban treaty, I think it will very much depend upon what will happen to those countries who have not yet signed or ratified the treaty. If they can get a sizable majority, I would say comfortable majority of states joining the ban treaty, then it starts to get what they call the force of international norm. It may not be legal obligation, but there's some kind of international norm under which you are discouraged from having nuclear weapons. That's one goal to have. Otherwise, I hope that both NPT and the ban treaty remain as a viable treaty in the world so that we can stop nuclear proliferation. In the meantime, pressing the weapon possessing countries to work harder on nuclear disarmament and eventually to the elimination.
And perhaps let me just add to that, because what the ambassador described is exactly what research on international relations in political sciences has found out during the last 10 or 15 years when it comes to norms research. That is, you have so-called norm entrepreneurs. Those can be persons or states or companies or perhaps a campaign like ICANN that starts pushing a certain norm that work particularly often with instruments of naming and shaming, that is calling out states or others for wrong behavior. And then slowly this norm builds up until it reaches a so-called tipping point, and then a norm cascade starts, and the others that were skeptical at the beginning or said, this is not going to work, suddenly come into the fold. It's important to note that this process can as well work the other way around. So you can have a well-established norm, and where you have negative norm entrepreneurs, those ones that are contesting the norm, and a contestation process starts. You're calling into question, is that really working? Is that NPT really working? Isn't that instrument too old or whatnot? And suddenly it goes the other way around. So what I'm saying here is norms can be extremely powerful in international affairs, and perhaps this is where we're going in the future, because we might get less and less internationally signed and ratified agreements, particularly in the United States, but that's a special case. But then again, norms can also be, norms are precious things, we have to take care of them as well.
Once again to the ambassador, as I asked also Dr. Kuehn, what is your perspective? Japan, like Germany, hasn't signed the TPNW. How could Japan position itself in a constructive way towards the entry into force of the TPNW?
Well, Japan has been very much embarrassed with this new TPNW ban treaty, because Japan, since the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had been advocating for nuclear disarmament. And then all of a sudden this TPNW came up, and they had to take rather negative stance against it. And that was very much embarrassing for the Japanese government, I think. Therefore, they took a position that Japanese government will try to bridge the gap between the promoters of the ban treaty and the opponents of ban treaty. Okay, good idea. But it proved that it's not easy to do so. And I think first thing the Japanese government should do, well, this is all my personal view, they should do is to keep some distance from the camp who are pushing the countries not to sign or not to ratify the ban treaty. If you keep on doing so, you cannot do bridging. So that's the first thing they should do. And then they should organize a meeting, formal or informal, of those pros and cons to get together how to bridge the gaps. It's not easy, but I think the Japanese government can continue that efforts. And then also, you may start talking to the members of the ban treaty, how a member states of an alliance with the United States can join the treaty. Is there any way to do so? That's some people say, no, that's not possible because you depend on the nuclear deterrence. And that's exactly what the treaty forbids. Well, maybe so. Well, but in international relations, nothing is impossible. I think you can still talk and may find a way to do so. And also, Japan may be able to play a role in assisting the victims of nuclear bombs or nuclear tests, or in the future time, there may be victims of bomb again. And also environmental remediation to improve the environment contaminated by the nuclear radiation. Japan has special expertise, knowledge about these activities. So Japan can organize some group of willing countries to work on these things, even without joining the treaty. You can do so. And I think that's what the Japanese government should try to do. There's an example already. The United States is not party to the Ottawa Convention against anti-personnel landmines, but it is very active in demining activities or assisting the victims around the world. So you can do so. You don't have to be in a treaty to help the people.
So I'm coming now to the last round, and we'll put some questions to both of you. And the first question is, and I will start with Dr. Kuehn again. Germany as NATO member state and Japan as important partner, as we heard, of the US, are both benefiting from the nuclear deterrence doctrine of the US and of NATO. Do Japan and Germany indeed still need the extended nuclear deterrence provided by the United States?
My institute, for instance, in Hamburg, has been lobbying to withdraw the remaining US nuclear warheads that are stationed on German soil within the next couple of years. And in doing so, you run into a problem because you can simply say, okay, we have to remove them, 0.0, that's it. But then you are ignoring that Germany has commitments and that Germany is a state that very much tries to uphold multilateral values. Germany is a member of the European Union. Germany is a member of NATO. Germany has obligations to its eastern neighbors, to Poland, to the 3 Baltic states, where particularly in the Baltic states, in Lithuania, Germany has deployed conventional forces as a so-called tripwire deterrent against Russia, which means that perhaps most all German politicians do not believe in the power of a deterrent for Germany, but they do see the effect and the psychological value it has on its allies. It's a totally different thing if you have this debate in Warsaw or in Riga, or you have it in The Hague or in Brussels or in Berlin. And what I'm saying with this is we need to work towards scaling back the reliance on the idea of nuclear deterrence, because I think it is a long-term impediment to serious international cooperation, and it has been for too long. It has been since basically since the first use of nuclear weapons against Japan 75 years ago. So since 75 years, we're living with these weapons, and we're basically, not since 75 years, but almost 75 years living with the idea of nuclear deterrence. And I think we need to move away from that. But for doing so, it's not possible to simply rely on your own position and ignore what others are thinking. You need to put yourself in the shoes of the others, and then you need to make better arguments. That's basically the point. And here's what I said in the second round of this interview. Germany needs to be much more active and perhaps a bit more bolder in its political initiatives within NATO, in also convincing its Eastern allies that, for instance, arms control can also enhance security, but in a totally different way than simply deterring the other side.
Well, in this part of the world, Japan has North Korea having had the nuclear weapons and increasing the number and working on ballistic missiles. We also have China, who is fast modernizing and strengthening their nuclear forces. So it'll be very difficult as of today for the Japanese government to abandon the idea of nuclear deterrence. In fact, historically, successive Japanese prime ministers have asked the United States that the US will protect Japan with the nuclear weapons and try to confirm it again and again. So that's the situation. But I think there are ways we can make progress on this in this respect. As I agree with Dr. Kuehn that we can try to reduce the reliance on a nuclear deterrence. And that's already happening.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, American, Japanese military capabilities depend less and less on a nuclear deterrence, but depend more on conventional means. And so that is what is being tried. Reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our deterrence. But mind you, that means if the world is as it is, you have to strengthen the conventional deterrence. And, you know, that costs money for Germany and Japan. And vis-a-vis China, which is still growing very fast economically and getting more and more money, Japan can compete with them. So that's where arms control comes into play. We need to have a good arms control and political environment improved to have less reliance on the nuclear and the conventional deterrence. That is what we need to work on. I remember once the Russian wise man said, a world without nuclear weapons is not just today's world minus nuclear weapons. They argued it doesn't happen that way. You have to improve the world situation, security environment, so that countries become encouraged to give up nuclear weapons. I think that's what we should work on.
Do you also see there is a shift in tone towards the ban treaty, and does that also change the basic premises that we see at the NATO doctrine? What, if anything, does this mean for the NPT and the TPNW and the overall nuclear disarmament architecture? I think we tackled these questions a little bit, but I would like to summarize that. Is there a change? Do you both see a change? Dr. Kuehn, I would start with you again and then go to Ambassador.
Once you have a majority of states that have signed and also ratified this treaty, then this treaty is there. You cannot ignore it. There is no way around it. And yes, it will lead to a softening of tone. But honestly, I think even without the ban treaty entering into force in January 2021, I think we would have seen a softening of tone, because the last couple of years were simply just too confrontational from both camps. I was in Washington from 2016 to 2017 for a year, working for the Carnegie Endowment, and being in Washington and going to all those think tank events where you talk about nukes and whatnot, it was clear that for the US defense establishment, there is no way that they accept this ban treaty, and they were basically laughing about this. I think this attitude needs to change. So when the ambassador said, keep distance from the anti-ban pushers, that's exactly what you should do. And I think that the more clever ones, also in the nuclear armed states, are recognizing that they need to change the tone, and they are doing. And whether Belgium and Netherlands will break the ranks.
How do you do it? Well, I think you have to bring in a number of arguments. One thing is that Reagan-Gorbachev statement, in which they said, there's no winner in a nuclear war, and the war should never be fought. Okay, if that is so, why do you keep nuclear weapons? It's the kind of weapons you can never use. Why do you spend the billions of dollars on them? And also, there'll be huge humanitarian consequences. And in view of that, you can never use them. So again, why do you keep them, and why do you depend your security on that kind of weapon you cannot use? So,
oh, sorry. Yeah.
Pursuing all those arguments, eventually we should be able to persuade those countries to give up. And also, one day there may be better weapons than nuclear weapons to guarantee your security. And that's a day when the world will decide to give them up.
I think that were fantastic last words for these interviews, and I can skip my last questions more or less, although I would also like to give Dr. Kuehn still the chance. My final question would have been, what are the prospects? Will we ever achieve the main goal of a nuclear weapons-free world? And if yes, when? Short answer, Dr. Kuehn. And I think Ambassador Abe already gave us the answer, but I will give you also the word again. So Dr. Kuehn.
Yeah, once more, I refer to the ambassador. He said very knowledgeable things, and he said nothing is impossible. So yeah, that's the point. Nothing is impossible. We need to be aware that this works both ways. Nothing is impossible in a negative way, but also nothing is impossible in a positive way. I am not sure whether it's the small steps that we need more, or that we need to be more bold, perhaps, or perhaps it should be a mixture of those two strategies in the years ahead.
Thanks, Dr. Kuehn. Ambassador Abe.
Well, the best way to abolish nuclear weapons is for the world to become enlightened about the humanitarian consequences, and the utility of nuclear weapons, and become enlightened and decide to give them up soon. That's the best option, but that may be difficult to achieve. So the next option is negotiate among those having nuclear weapons to give them up. The last one is one day the world will come up with a new, better weapon, more discriminate. You can kill, destroy exactly the target you wanted, but no other ones. Better weapon than nuclear weapons, but that is not a good option either.
I would totally agree with you on that. So that leaves me just for really thanking both of you. For me, it was an absolutely interesting journey. Thank you so much for engaging with me on these questions. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Kuehn. And my last task is now to hand over back to Dr. Holtgreen. Thanks a lot.